Ernst Jünger's Storm of Steel. Chapter 6. The Beginning of the Battle of the Somme. In mid-April 1916, I was detailed to attend an officer training course under the overall direction of the divisional commander, Major General Sontag, at Crozet, a little town behind the divisional lines. There, we received instruction in a variety of practical and theoretical military subjects. Particularly fascinating were the tactical excursions on horseback under Major von Urotsky, a fat little staffer who would get terribly excited about things. We called him the pressure cooker. A series of excursions and inspection visits to the often very improvised units in the hinterland gave us, who were in the habit of viewing things slightly askance everything that happened there, an insight into the incredible work that goes on behind a line of fighting men. And so we visited the abattoir, the commissariat, and gunnery repair workshops in Boyes, the sawmill and pioneer park in the woods of Bourlon, the dairy, pig farm, and rendering plant in Inchy, the aviation park and bakery in Quien. On Sundays, we went to the nearby towns of Cambrai, Douai, and Valenciennes to remind ourselves of what ladies in hats look like. It would be rather mean of me, in this book that has so much blood in it, if I were to withhold from you an account of a scrape in which my part was a somewhat comical one. Back in winter, when my battalion was a guest of the King of Quien, I had, as a young officer, been called upon to inspect the guard for the first time. On the edge of town, I had promptly lost my way, and, meaning to ask for directions to the little station guard post, I had walked into a tiny cottage that stood there all by itself. Living there, I found, all alone, as her father had lately died, was a 17-year-old girl by the name of Jeanne. When she gave me directions, she laughed, and when I asked what was so funny, she said, "You're so young, I wish I could have your future." Because of the spiritedness of her remark, I had dubbed her Jeanne d'Arc, and in the subsequent trench fighting, I had occasionally thought of that isolated little house. One evening in Crozet, I suddenly felt an urge to go over there. I had a horse saddled up, and before long had left the town behind me. It was a May evening, perfect time for a ride. The clover lay like heavy burgundy cushions on the fields stitched with hawthorn, and outside the village gates the huge candles of flowering chestnuts flickered in the gloaming. I rode through Bellecourt and Escourt, never guessing that in 2 years' time I would find myself making ready to attack the hideous ruins of these villages, now nestling so peaceably among ponds and hills at eventide. At the little station I had inspected in the winter, civilians were still busy unloading cylinders of propane. I greeted them and watched them for a while. Before long, the house appeared in front of me, with its reddish-brown, bemossed roof. I rapped at the shutters, which were already bolted shut. "Qui est là? Bonjour, Jeanne d'Arc! Ah, bonjour, mon petit officer Gibraltar!" I was made as pleasantly welcome as I'd hoped I would be. After tying up my horse, I went inside and was asked to share her supper of eggs, white bread and butter, all nicely laid out on a large cabbage leaf. Seeing such things, one really doesn't need a second invitation. Everything would have been fine and dandy, but as I stepped out to leave, I found a torch shining in my eyes, and a military policeman asking me for my documentation. My talking to the civilians, the attentiveness with which I'd observed the gas cylinders, my unexplained appearance in this sparsely garrisoned district, all had aroused a suspicion of espionage. Of course I hadn't brought my service book with me, and so had to be led before the King of Quien, who was, as usual, at that time of night, presiding over his round table. Luckily, I found a sympathetic ear there. I was identified and made welcome. On this occasion, I came away with a rather different impression of the king. The hour was late, and he was talking about tropical jungles where he had spent a lot of his time in charge of the building of a railway line. On the 16th of June, the general sent us back to our units with a little speech, from which we were given to understand that our opponents were preparing a large-scale offensive on the Western Front, with its left flank facing our own position. This was our first inkling of what was to be the Battle of the Somme. It marked the end of the first and mildest part of the war. Thereafter, it was like embarking on a different one altogether. What we had, admittedly, almost unbeknown to ourselves, been through had been the attempt to win a war by old-fashioned pitched battles, and the stalemating of the attempt in static warfare. What confronted us now was a war of material, of the most gigantic proportions. This war was in turn replaced towards the end of 1917 by mechanized warfare, though that was not given time fully to develop. The sense that something was imminent hardened once we returned to our regiments, because our comrades told us of the increasing activity of the enemy. The British had twice, albeit unsuccessfully, essayed a raid of force against Sector C. We had retaliated with a well-prepared assault by 3 officers' patrols against the so-called Trench Triangle, in the course of which we had taken several prisoners. While I'd been away, Wetja had been wounded by a shrapnel ball on the arm, but resumed command of the company shortly after my return. My dugout was somewhat changed as well. A direct hit had just about halved its dimensions. During that aforementioned raid, the British had fumigated it with a few hand grenades. My replacement had managed to squeeze his way out through the skylight, while his Batman had perished. His blood was still visible in great brown stains across the lining boards. On the 20th of June, I was ordered to eavesdrop on the enemy trenches, to find out whether they were trying to undermine us, and with Ensign Wohlgemuth, Lance Corporal Schmidt, and Fusilier Parvenfelder, I set out a little before midnight across our own pretty high wire entanglements. The first stretch we did hunched forward, and then we crept side by side over the densely grown field. Fourth form memories of Karl May came to me as I slithered along on my front through the dewy grass and thistles, anxious to avoid the slightest rustle. With the British lines visible barely 50 yards in front of us as a black stroke against the gray. From a great distance, a spray of machine gun bullets came down almost perpendicularly on top of us. An occasional flare went up and threw its chilled light on our already rather inhospitable patch of land. Then there was a loud rustling behind us. 2 shadows were dashing between the trenches. Even as we made ready to throw ourselves upon them, they had disappeared. Moments later, the thunder of 2 hand grenades in the British trenches indicated that we had brushed past some of our own. We continued to creep forward. Suddenly, the ensign gripped my arm. "Watch out! Right. Very close. Shh! Shh!" And then, no more than 10 paces away, I heard sundry rustlings in the grass. We had lost our orientation and had been creeping along parallel to the English lines. Presumably, the enemy had heard us and had now emerged from his trenches to see what was going on. These moments of nocturnal prowling leave an indelible impression. Eyes and ears are tense to the maximum. The rustling approach of strange feet in the tall grass is an unutterable, menacing thing. Your breath comes in shallow bursts. You have to force yourself to stifle any panting or wheezing. There's a little mechanical click as the safety catch on your pistol is taking off. The sound cuts straight through your nerves. Your teeth are grinding on the fuse pin of the hand grenade. The encounter will be short and murderous. You tremble with 2 contradictory impulses, the heightened awareness of the huntsman and the terror of the quarry. You are a world to yourself, saturated with the appalling aura of the savage landscape. A line of dim forms surfaced, their whispers carried across to us. We turned to look at them. I heard the Bavarian Parvenfelder biting the blade of his knife. They took a few more steps towards us, and then started working on their wires. Seemingly not having noticed us, we crept very slowly backwards, keeping our eyes fixed on them. Death, which had already loomed up expectantly between us, slunk away dejectedly. After a little, we stood up and went on, till we reached our sector safely. Our expedition's fortunate conclusion gave us the idea of taking a prisoner, and we decided to go again the next night. I had just lain down, therefore, for an afternoon nap when I was startled up by a thunderous din outside my dugout. The British were lobbing toffee apples across, which, even though they made very little noise as they were fired, were so heavy that their splinters ripped away the massive posts of the revetment. Swearing, I climbed up from my bed and went into the trench. Only, the next time I saw one of the black weights arcing towards us to shout, "Mortar coming left!" and nip into the nearest shelter. In the course of the next few weeks, we were so abundantly graced with trench mortars of all shapes and sizes that we got in the habit, each time we found ourselves walking along the trench, of keeping one eye aloft and the other on the entrance to the nearest deep dugout. That night, my 3 companions and I once more crept out between the trenches. We crawled along on our toes and elbows till right up to the British entanglements, where we hid behind clumps of grass. After a while, some British came out, dragging a roll of wire after them. They stopped close in front of us, put the roll down, snipped at it with wire cutters, and talked in whispers. We sidled together and had a hasty discussion. "Toss a hand grenade in there. And pick up the pieces. Come on. There's 4 of them. Don't talk. Rubbish. Quiet. Quiet down." My warning came too late. As I looked up, the British were darting lizard-like under their wires and disappeared into their trench. The feeling now got a little clammy. The thought, now they're going to bring up a machine gun, gave me a bad taste in my mouth. The others entertained similar fears. We slid back as quickly as we could, with quite a jangle. The British lines woke up. Drumming of feet, whispers, running hither and thither. Psht! A flare. All around it was as bright as day. While we tried to press our heads into the grass, another flare. Turkey moments. You wish the earth would swallow you up. You'd rather be anywhere than where you are. 10 yards in front of the enemy lines. Another one. Pow! Pow! The unmistakable, crisp, and deafening report of rifle shots, fired at almost point-blank range. Christ! They've seen us! No longer worried about making noise, we called to each other to run for our lives, and leapt up and raced towards our own lines through the now pattering gunfire. After a few bounds, I stumbled and landed in a small and very shallow crater. While the other 3 raced past me, thinking I was done for, I pressed myself to the ground, pulled in my hand and my legs, and allowed the bullets to brush over me. Every bit as menacing were the burning lumps of magnesium from the flares, which burned down very close to me in some cases, and which I tried to pat away with my cap. Eventually, the shooting relented, and, after a further quarter of an hour, I left my hiding hole, slowly and cautiously to begin with, and then as fast as my hands and feet could carry me. Since the moon had set by now, I soon became utterly disorientated, and had no idea where the British or the German lines were. Not even the distinctive shape of the ruined mill at Monchy was visible against the horizon. The odd bullet from one side or the other streaked over the ground. In the end, I lay down in the grass and determined to wait for morning. Suddenly, I had heard some whispers very close by. I prepared to do battle, and then cautiously made a series of indeterminate natural sounds that I had thought might pass equally well for German as English. I resolved to reply to the first English call I received with a hand grenade. Then, to my delight, it turned out that the whispering was that of my little troop, who were just in the process of taking off their belts to carry my body back. We sat for a while longer in a bomb crater, and were overjoyed at seeing each other again. Then we made our way back to our own trenches. All told, our adventure had taken 3 hours. I was back on trench duty again at 5, in number 1 platoon's part of the line. I ran into Sergeant Hawk, standing outside his dugout. When I expressed surprise at seeing him out so early, he informed me that he was lying in wait for a large rat whose gnawing and rustling had kept him up all night. And from time to time, he would look ruefully at his absurdly small dugout, which he had christened Villa Fat of the Land Chicken. While we were standing together, we heard a distant sound of firing, which boded nothing in particular to us, but Hawk, who the day before had almost been brained by a large mortar bomb, and was therefore very apprehensive, dived into the nearest shelter. Sliding down the first 15 steps in a haste, and finding space in the next 15 for 3 virtuoso somersaults. I stood up by the entrance, laughing so hard I forgot all about the mortars and the shelters. When I heard the poor chap bewailing this painful curtailed rat hunt, all the while rubbing various sore joints and attempting to put back a dislocated thumb. The unhappy man went on to tell me he'd just been sitting down to eat the night before when the mortar bomb had come along. As a result, he'd got grit all over his dinner and had made a first painful acquaintance with the flights of steps. He had just arrived here from home and wasn't yet used to our roughneck ways. From early morning on, our trench was subjected to mortar attack at shorter and shorter intervals. By noon, I'd had enough. With a few other fellows, I got our lance mortar set up and aimed at our opponent's trenches. A pretty feeble reply, admittedly, to the heavy bombs we'd been plowed with. Sweating and swatting at a little dip in the trench, the clay baked hard by the June sun, and sent bomb after bomb towards their lines. Since the British seemed quite unperturbed, I went with Wetja to the telephone, where, after some thought, we agreed on the following form of words. Helen's spitting in our trenches. We need potatoes, big ones and little ones. We used this type of language when there was a chance that the enemy might be listening in, and before long we were pleased to hear back from Lieutenant Deichmann that the fat police, with the stiff mustaches and a couple of his little friends, would be brought up. And before long, and the first of our 200-weight bombs flew into the enemy trenches, followed by a few units of field artillery, with the result that we were left in peace for the rest of the day. Midday the following day, the dance began again, but significantly increased. At the first shot, I took my subterranean passage to the second line, and from there to the communications trench, where we had set up our own mortar encampment. We opened fire in such a way that every time we received a toffee apple, we replied with a lance. After exchanging about 40 mortars, the enemy gunner seemed to be finding his range. His missiles were coming down to the right and left of us, without being able to interrupt our activity until one was seen heading straight for us. At the very last moment, we pulled our trigger one last time, and then ran as fast as we could. I had just made it to a mucky, wired stretch of trench when the monster blew up just behind me. The enormous air pressure threw me over a bundle of barbed wire into a shell hole full of greenish water, and sent a sparkling of hard clay shards on top of me. I picked myself up, feeling very groggy and disheveled. My boots and trousers were ripped by the barbed wire, my hands and uniform were struck with thick clay, and my knee was bleeding from a long wound. Rather the worse for wear, I slunk back through the trench to my dugout to get over the experience. Other than that, the mortars hadn't done much in the way of damage. The trench had taken a beating in a few places. A Priester mortar was smashed, and the Villa Fat of the Land chicken was no more. It had received a direct hit, while its unlucky owner was down in the deep dugout. Otherwise, in all probability, he would have practiced his third freestyle descent of the steps. The firing went on all afternoon without a break, and by evening it had been increased to drum fire by numbers of cylindrical bombs. We referred to these missiles as wash-basket mortars, because it sometimes looked as they had been shaken down from the sky by the basket load. The best way of picturing their design is imagining a rolling pin with 2 short handles on it. Apparently, they were fired from special revolver-like drums and were sent spinning end over end through the air, making a somewhat labored wheezing sound. From a distance, they resembled flying sausages. These came down so thick and fast that their landing was like a torching of a basket of rockets. The toffee apple had something crushing or stamping about them. These had more of a rending effect on the nerves. We sat tensed and ready in the shelter entrances, prepared at any moment to repel invaders with rifle and hand grenades. But the bombardment died back after an hour and a half. In the night, we had 2 more bouts of firing to withstand, during which our sentries stood at their posts and indomitably kept watch. As soon as the gunning relented, numerous flares lit up the defenders, charging out from their shelters, and a brisk fire persuaded the enemy that there was still life in our lines. In spite of the heavy bombardment, we lost only one man, Fusilier Diersmann, whose skull was smashed by a mortar bomb landing on the parapet in front of him. Another man was wounded in the back. On the day after this unquiet night, numerous bursts of firing prepared us for an imminent attack. In that time, our trenches really were shot to pieces, and the smashed timber from their revetment made them almost impassable. A number of dugouts were also flattened. Brigade headquarters sent an intelligence report to the front. Intercepted British telephone message. The British have precise descriptions of the gaps in our lines and have requested steel helmets. It is not known whether steel helmet is code for heavy mortars. Be prepared. We resolved to be on alert for anything the coming night, and agreed that anyone who didn't give his name in response to a "Hallo" would be immediately fired at. Every officer had his pistol loaded with a red flare to alert the artillery. The night was still wilder than the last. In particular, one concentration of fire at 2:15 outdid anything there had been up until that point. A hail of heavy shells struck all round my dugout. We stood fully armed on the shelter steps, while the light of our little candle stumps reflected glitteringly off the wet, mildewed walls. Blue smoke streamed up in throughout the entrances, and earth crumbling off the ceiling. Boom! Good God! A light! A light! Get everything ready! Everyone's hearts were in their mouths. Hands darted to release the pins on bombs. That was the last of them! Let's go! As we charged off to the entrance, a mine with a delay fuse went off and hurled us back inside. All the same, as the last of the iron birds came whooshing down, all the sentry positions were manned by us. Bright as day, a firework display of flares lit the cloud-swathed field. These instants, in which the entire complement of men stood behind the traverses, tensed and ready, had something magical about them. They were like the last breathless second before a hugely important performance, as the music is turned off and the big spotlight goes up. For several hours that night, I stood leaning against the entrance to my dugout, which, irregularly, faced the enemy, from time to time looking at my watch, to take down notes about the levels of fire. I eyed the sentry, an older man with children, standing completely impassive with his rifle, lit from time to time by the flash of an explosion. Oddly, it was after the shooting had subsided that we took another casualty. Fusilier Neinhauser suddenly fell from his sentry post and came crashing down the shelter steps to join his comrades, who were all assembled at the bottom. When they inspected the eerie arrival, all they could find on him was a small wound on his forehead and a puncture over the right nipple from which blood was flowing. It remained unclear whether the wound or the sudden fall had killed him. At the end of the night of terror, we were relieved by the 6th. In the grumpy mood produced by the appearance of the sun following a sleepless night, we marched down the communication trenches to Monchy, and from there to the reserve line, set back at the edge of the Adenifer forest, that afforded us box seats for the overture of the Somme battles. The sectors to our left were still swathed in black and white smoke. One massive explosion after another sent the dirt spewing up past rooftop height and over them. Hundreds of speedy lightnings produced by bursting shrapnels. Only the colored signals, the mute appeals to the artillery for help, indicated that there was still life in the trenches. This was the first time I had seen artillery fire to match a natural spectacle. In the evening, just as we hoped for a good night's sleep at last, we were given orders to load trench mortar ammunition at Monchy, and had to spend all night waiting up in vain for a lorry that had gotten stuck, while the British made various, fortunately unsuccessful attempts on our lives, either by means of high-angled machine gun fire or sweeping the road with shrapnels. We were especially irritated by one machine gunner who sprayed his bullets at such an angle that they came down near vertically, with acceleration produced by sheer gravity. There was absolutely no point in trying to duck behind walls. That night, the enemy gave us an example of his painstaking observation skills. In the second line, perhaps a mile and a quarter from the enemy, we had left a heap of chalk in front of what was to be a subterranean munitions dump. The British drew the unfortunately correct conclusion that this dump was to be massed over in the course of the night, and fired a group of shrapnels at it, succeeding in gravely wounding 3 of our men. In the morning, I was shaken out of my sleep yet again by the order to lead my platoon on a digging detail to Sector C. My sections were broken up and divided amongst the 6th Company. I accompanied some of them back to the Adenifer woods to get them chopping timber. On the way back to the trench, I stopped in my dugout for a quick catnap, but it was no good. I was unable to get any rest in those days. No sooner had I pulled off my boots than I heard our artillery firing with unwonted animation from their position on the edge of the woods. At the same time, my Batman, Polika, materialized at the entrance of the shelter and shouted down, "Gas attack!" I broke out the gas mask, got into my boots, buckled up, ran out, and saw a huge cloud of gas hanging over Monchy in thick white swaths, and drifting under a slight breeze in the direction of .124 on the low ground. Since my platoon was for the most part in the front line, and an attack was probable, there wasn't much time to stop and think. I leaped over the ramparts of the reserve line, raced forward, and soon found myself enveloped in gas cloud. The penetrating smell of chlorine confirmed for me that this was indeed fighting gas, and not, as I had briefly thought, artificial fog. I therefore donned my mask, only to tear it off again right away because I'd been running so fast that the mask didn't give me enough air to breathe. Also, the goggles misted over in no time, and completely whited out. All this, of course, heartily the stuff of what to do in a gas attack, which I'd taught myself often. Since I felt pain in my chest, I tried at least to put the cloud behind me as fast as I could. At the entrance to the village, I needed to get through a barrage of gunfire, whose impacts, topped by numerous clouds of shrapnel, drew a long and even chain across the barren and otherwise unfrequented fields. Artillery fire in open country never has the same effect, either physically or on one's morale, as it does among dwellings or fortifications. I had therefore broken through the line of fire and found myself in Monchy, which lay under an extraordinary hail of shrapnel. A shower of balls, splinters, and fuses came hissing and whizzing through the branches of the fruit trees in the neglected gardens, or smacked against the masonry. In a dugout in the garden, I saw my company comrades, Sievers and Vogel, sitting. They had lit a merry wood fire, and were leaning over the cleansing flame to escape the effects of the chlorine. I joined them there, until the fire had slackened off a bit, and then went forward down the communication trench 6. As I went on, I looked at all the little animals lying in the pit of the trench, killed by the chlorine, and thought, the barrage is bound to start up any moment now, and if you continue taking your time, you'll be caught out in the open, like a mouse in a trap. And yet, I continued, phlegmatically at my own pace. Exactly what I had anticipated happened. Not more than 50 yards away from the company shelter, I found myself in a whole new and much worse bombardment, in which it seemed completely impossible to get through even this short stretch of trench without being hit. Luckily for me, I saw right by me one of those occasional niches that were carved into the trench walls for dispatch runners. 3 dugout frames, not a whole lot, but better than none at all. So I pressed myself in there and allowed the storm to pass. Unwittingly, I seemed to have chosen the liveliest corner going. Light and heavy toffee apples, Stokes bombs, shrapnels, rattles, shells of all kind. I could no longer identify everything that was buzzing and whizzing and crashing around me. I was reminded of my corporal at Les Espages and his exclamation, "What in God's name are those things?" Occasionally my ears were utterly deafened by a single fiendish crashing burn of flame. Then incessant hissing gave me the sense of hundreds of pound weights rushing down at incredible speed, one after the other. Or a dud shell landed with a short, heavy, ground-shaking thump. Shrapnels burst down by the dozens, like dainty crackers, shook loose their little balls in a dense cloud, and the empty casings rasped after they were gone. Each time a shell landed anywhere close, the earth flew up and down, and metal shards drove themselves into it. It's an easier matter to describe these sounds than to endure them, because one cannot but associate every single sound of flying steel with the idea of death. And so I huddled down in my hole in the ground with my hand in front of my face, imagining all the possible variants of being hit. I think I found a comparison that captures the situation in which I and all the other soldiers who took part in this war so often found ourselves. You must imagine you are securely tied to a post, being menaced by a man swinging a heavy hammer. Now the hammer has been taken back over his head, ready to be swung. Now it's cleaving the air towards you, on the point of touching your skull. Then it struck the post, and the splinters are flying. That's what it's like to experience heavy shelling in an exposed position. Luckily, I still had a bit of that subliminal feeling of optimism. It'll be alright, that you feel during a game, say, and which, while it may be quite unfounded, still has a soothing effect on you. And indeed, even this shelling came to an end, and I could go on my way once more, and, this time, with some urgency. At the front, the men were all busy greasing their rifles in accordance with the nostrums of what to do in a gas attack, because their barrels had been completely blackened by chlorine. An ensign dolefully showed me his new sword knot, which had quite lost its silver sheen and had been turned a greenish black. Since our opponents seemed not to be making a move, I took my troops back to the rear. Outside the company office in Monchy, we saw a lot of men affected by gas, pressing their hands against their sides and groaning and retching while their eyes watered. It was bad business, because a few of them went on to die over the next several days in terrible agony. We had to withstand an attack with chlorine, which has a burning, corrosive effect on the lungs. Henceforth, I resolved never to go anywhere without my gas mask, having previously, incredibly foolishly, often left it behind in my dugout, and used it in case, like a botanist, as a container for sandwiches. Seeing this taught me a lesson. On the way back, meaning to buy something, I had gone into the 2nd Battalion canteen, where I found a dejected canteen boy standing surrounded by a broken crockery. A shell had come through the ceiling and gone off in the store, converting its treasures into a melange of jam, liquid soap, and punctured containers of this and that. He had just, with Prussian pernicketness, done his accounting, showing a loss of 82 marks and 58 pfennigs. In the evening, because of the uncertain position of my platoon, my platoon, which had so far been withdrawn to the second line, was moved forward to the village, and was housed in the quarry. We settled ourselves into its numerous nooks and crannies, and lit an enormous fire, whose smoke went up through the well shaft, greatly to the annoyance of some of our company cooks, who were almost asphyxiated as they pulled up their buckets of water. Since we had been issued with strong grog, we sat on limestone blocks around the fire, and sang and talked and smoked. Round about midnight, all hell was let loose in the curved front enclosing Monchy. Dozens of alarm clocks rang, hundreds of rifles went off, and white and green flares went up unceasingly. Next, a barrage of fire went off. Heavy trench mortars crashed, drawing plumes of fiery sparks among them. Wherever in the maze of our ruins there was a human soul, and long drawn-out cry went up, "Gas attack! Gas attack! Gas! Gas! Gas!" By the light of the flares, a dazzling flow of gas billowed over the black jags of masonry. Since there was a heavy smell of chlorine in the quarry as well, we lit large straw fires at the entrances, whose acrid smoke almost drove us out of our refuge, and forced us to try and cleanse the air by waving coats and tarpaulins. The next day, we were able to marvel at the traces of gas had left. A large proportion of the plants had withered, snails and moles lay dead, and the horses that were stabled in Monchy for use by the messengers had watering eyes and muzzles. The shells and ammunition splinters that lay all over the place had a fetching green patina. The cloud had been noticed as far away as Duchy, where rattled civilians had assembled outside Colonel von Oppen's quarters and demanded gas masks. Instead, they were loaded onto lorries and driven to towns and villages set back from the front. The following night, we were in the quarry again. In the evening, I was given the news that coffee would be provided at 4:15 in the morning, as an English deserter had said an attack was planned for 5. And indeed, no sooner than the coffee bringers roused us the next morning than the almost familiar shout of "Gas attack!" rang out. There was a Swedish smell in the air, and, as we were later to find out, this was phosgene to which we were to be treated. In the ring around Monchy, Powerful drum fire was raging, but that ebbed away before long. This anxious hour turned into a bracing morning. From Communication Trench 6, Lieutenant Brecht emerged onto the village street with a bloody bandage wrapped around his hand, accompanied by a soldier with fixed bayonet and an English captive. Brecht was given a triumphant reception by Headquarters West and told us the following. The British had let off clouds of gas and smoke at 5 in the morning and had gone to rattle our trench with mortar fire. Our soldiers, as was their custom, had leapt out of their shelters whilst the bombing was still in progress, and we had taken more than 30 casualties. Then, still hidden in the smoke, 2 large British raiding parties had appeared, one of which had got into the trench and taken a wounded NCO of ours. The other never made it past the wire entanglement. The single exception, Brecht, who before the war had been a plantation owner in America, now seized by the throat and greeted with the words, "Come here, you son of a bitch!" The captive was presently being treated to a glass of wine and looking with half-frightened, half-puzzled eyes to the deserted village street, now filling with ration parties, ambulance-men, dispatch carriers, and various nondescript onlookers. He was a tall fellow, very young, fresh-faced, and with fair hair. What a shame to have to shoot at such people went through my head as I saw him. Soon a long line of stretchers arrived at the dressing station. A lot of wounded men came from Monchy South as well, because the enemy had also succeeded in breaking into the line briefly in the east sector. One of the assailants must have been an amazing character. He had leapt into the trench, apparently unremarked, and run along it, past the backs of the sentries, who all had their eyes on the field in front of them. One after the other, he leaped on them from behind. The gas masks restricted further their field of vision, and, having felled a number of them with blows of a club or rifle butt, returned, equally unremarked, to the British lines. When the trench was tidied up later, 8 sentries were found with broken skulls. About 50 stretchers, with men lying groaning on all of them, in blood-soaked bandages, were laid out in front of some sheets of corrugated metal, under which the doctor did his business, with sleeves rolled up. One young fellow, whose blue lips shone rather ominously from his ghostly white face, was mumbling to himself, "I'm too badly. They won't be able. I'm sure. I'll die." A fat NCO from the medical corps looked at him pityingly, and several times, and breathed a comforting, "Come on, mate, come on." Even though the British thoroughly prepared this little attack designed to tie up forces here to favor their offensive in the Somme, with plenty of trench mortar attacks and clouds of poison gas, they only managed to take alive a single wounded prisoner, whereas they left plenty of dead on our wires. Of course, our losses were also substantial. The regiment later that morning mourned over 40 dead, among them 3 officers, and a good number of wounded as well. The following afternoon, we finally moved back for a few days to our beloved Duchy. The same evening, we celebrated the success of the engagement with several well-earned bottles. On the 1st of July, it was our sorry task to bury a proportion of our dead in our churchyard. 39 wooden coffins, with the names written in pencil on the unplaned planks, were laid side by side in the pit. The minister spoke on the text, "They have fought a good fight," beginning with the words, "Gibraltar, that is your motto, and why not? For have you not stood firm like the rock in the sea surge?" It was in the course of these days that I learned to appreciate these men, with whom I was to be together for 2 more years of the war. What was at stake here was a British initiative on such a small scale as barely to find mention in the histories of both armies, intended to commit us to a sector where the main attack would not be. Nor did the men have very much to do, only covering the very small amount of ground from the entrance of the shelter to the sentry posts. But these few steps it needed to be taken in the instant of great crescendo of fire before an attack, the precise timing of which is a matter of gut instinct and feeling. The dark wave that so many times in those nights welled up in the traverses through raging fire, and without even an order being possible, remained with me in my heart as a personal yardstick for human trustworthiness. Especially strongly marked is the memory of the position, broken and still steaming, as I walked through it shortly after the attack. The day's sentries were already in position, while the trenches had yet to be cleared. Here and there, the sentry posts were covered with dead, and, in among them, as it were, arisen from their bodies, stood the new relief of his rifle. There was an odd rigidity about these composites. It was as though the distinction between alive and dead had momentarily been taken away. On the evening of the 3rd of July, we moved back up to the front. It was relatively quiet, but there were little indications that there was something afoot. There was soft and incessant hammering from the mill at all times, as though metal were being fashioned. We had intercepted numerous telephone calls to an English pioneer officer at the very front concerning gas cylinders and explosions. From dawn to the last gleam of light at the end of the day, English airplanes kept up a dense pattern of overflying to keep us and the hinterland apart. The trench bombardments were substantially harder than usual. Also, there was a suspicious change of target, as though new batteries were set to finding their range. In spite of all this, we were relieved on the 12th of July, without too much disagreeableness, and went into the reserve at Monchy. On the evening of the 13th, our dugouts in the garden came under fire from a 10-inch naval gun, whose massive shells rumbled at us in a low arc. They burst with a terrific bang. At night, we were woken up by intense fire and gas attack. We sat round the stove in the dugout in our gas masks, all except Vogel, who had lost his, and was running around like a madman looking in all corners, while a few sadistic fellows, whom he'd given a hard time, reported that the smell of gas was getting stronger and stronger. In the end, I gave him my refill, and he sat for an hour behind the smoking stove, holding his nose and sucking the mouthpiece. On the same day, I lost 2 men from my platoon, wounded as they went around the village. Hasselmann had a bullet through his arm, while Maschmeyer caught a shrapnel ball through the throat. There was no attack at night. Even so, the regiment lost another 25 dead, and a great many wounded. On the 15th and the 17th, we had further gas attacks to endure. On the 17th, we were relieved, and twice suffered heavy bombardment in Duchy. One of them came just as we were having an officers' meeting with Major von Żrotsky in an orchard. It was dangerous, but it was still ridiculous to watch the company suddenly burst apart, fall on their faces, force their way through hedges in an absolute trice, and disappear under various cover before you could count to 10. A shell falling in the garden of my lodgings killed a little girl who had been digging around for rubbish in a pit. On the 20th of July, we moved back up. On the 28th, I arranged with Ensign Wolgamut and Privates Bartels and Binkner to go on another one of our patrols. We had nothing more in mind than to wander around between the lines to see what was new in no man's land, because we were beginning to get a little bored with the trench. In the afternoon, Lieutenant Browns, the officer with the 6th Company, who was relieving me, paid me a call to my dugout, bringing a fine Burgundy with him. Towards midnight, we broke up. I went out into the trench, where my 3 companions were already assembled in the lee of a traverse. After I had picked out a few bombs that looked dry and in working order, I climbed over the wire in a high good humor, and Bronze called out a jovial "break a leg" after me. In quick time, we had crept up to the enemy barrier. Just before it, we came across a pretty stout and well-insulated wire in some long grass. I was of the opinion that information was important here, and instructed Wolgamut to cut off a piece and take it with him. While he was sawing away at it with, for want of a more appropriate tools, a cigar clipper, we heard something jiggling the wire. A few British soldiers appeared and started working without noticing us, pressed as we were in the long grass. Mindful of our hard time on the previous expedition, I breathed, "Wolgamut, toss a hand grenade at that lot." "Lieutenant, shouldn't we let them work a little bit more first?" "Ensign, that was an order." Even here, in the wasteland, the magic words took effect. With the sinking feeling of a man embarking on an uncertain adventure, I listened to the dry crack of the pulled fuse and watched Wolgamut, to offer less of a target, Trundle, almost roll the grenade at the British group. It stopped in a thicket almost in the middle of them. They seemed not to have seen anything. A few moments of a great tension ticked by. Crash! A flash of lightning lit up their sprawling figures. With a shout of, "You are prisoners!" we launched ourselves like tigers into the dense white smoke. A desperate scene developed in fractions of a second. I held my pistol in the middle of a face that seemed to loom out of the dark at me like a pale mask. A shadow slammed back against the barbed wire with a grunt. There was a ghastly cry, a sort of "wah!" of the sort that people only produce when they've seen a ghost. On my left, Wolgamut was banging away with his pistol, while Bartels in his excitement was throwing a hand grenade in our midst. After one shot, the magazine had clicked out of my pistol grip. I stood yelling in front of a Briton who, in his horror, was pressing his back into the barbed wire and kept pulling the trigger. Nothing happened. It was like a dream of impotence. Sounds came from the trench in front of us. Shouts rang out. Machine gun clattered to life. We jumped away. Once more I stopped in a crater and aimed my pistol at a shadowy form that was pursuing me. This time, it was just as well it didn't fire, because it was Bruckner, whom I had supposed to be safely back long ago. Then we raced towards our lines. Just before our wire, the bullets were coming so thick and fast that I had to leap into a water-filled, wire-laced mine crater. Dangling over the water on the swaying wire, I heard the bullets rushing past me like a huge swarm of bees, while scraps of wire and metal shards sliced into the rim of the crater. After half an hour or so, once the firing had abated, I made my way over the entanglements and leaped into our trench, to an enthusiastic reception. Wolgamut and Bartels were already back, and half an hour later, so was Bruckner. We were all pleased at the happy outcome, and only regretted that once again our intended captive had managed to get away. It was only afterwards that I had noticed that the experience had taken its toll on my nerves. When I was laying on my pallet in my dugout with teeth shattering and quite unable to sleep. Rather, I had the sensation of a sort of supreme awakening, as if I had an electric bell going off somewhere in my body. The following morning I could hardly walk, because over one knee, over other historic injuries, I had a long scrape from the barbed wire, while the other had caught some shards from Bartel's hand grenade. These short expeditions, where a man takes his life in his hands, were a good means of testing our mettle and interrupting the monotony of trench life. There's nothing worse for a soldier than boredom. On the 11th of August, there was a black riding stallion loose outside Burlay-au-Bois, which a territorial was finally able to kill with 3 bullets. The British officer it had escaped from wouldn't have been too pleased to see it in that condition. In the night, Fusilier Schultz caught a spent part of an English bullet in the eye. In Monchy, too, there were more casualties as the walls brought down by shelling now afforded less and less protection from the random sprays of machine gun bullets. We started to dig trenches right across the village and erected new walls near the most dangerous places. In the neglected gardens, the berries were ripe and tasted all the sweeter because of the bullets flying all around us as we ate them. And the 12th of August was the long-awaited day when, for the second time in the war, I had a home furlough. No sooner had I got home and settled in, though, than a telegram came winging after me. Return immediately. Further details from local command at Cambrai. And 3 hours later, I was on the train. On the way to the station, 3 girls in light dresses swayed past me, clutching tennis rackets, a shining last image of that sort of life, which was to stay with me a long time. On the 21st, I was back in familiar country, the roads swarming with soldiers on account of the departure of 111th and the arrival of a new division, the 1st Battalion. The 1st Battalion was based in the village of Ecaust-Saint-Maine, whose wreckage we were to reoccupy on our advance 2 years from now. I was welcomed by Pollica, whose days were also numbered. He told me that the young fellows from my platoon must have inquired about a dozen times whether I wasn't back yet. It stirred and revived me to hear that. I realized that in the hot days that were ahead of us, I had a following based not only on rank, but also on character. That night, I was put up with 8 other officers in the loft of an empty house. We stayed up a long time and, for want of anything stronger, sat drinking coffee that a couple of Frenchwomen made for us in the house next door. We knew there was a battle impending, the like of which the world had not seen. We felt no less aggressive than the troops who had marched over the border 2 years before, but we were more experienced and therefore more dangerous. We were up for it, in the best and most cheerful condition, and expressions like avoid contact with the enemy were not in our vocabulary. Anyone seeing the men round this jolly table would have to tell themselves that positions entrusted to them would only be lost when the last defender had fallen. And that indeed proved to be the case. This has been Chapter 6 of Ernst Jünger's Storm of Steel.